Something doesn't add up. We are reading fewer books than ever. The books we are reading are romantasy, aka smut, aka not literature. People are consuming more images than ever. We are surrounded by screens. And a lot of those screens are bringing us pornographic images or semi-pornographic images. Yet, people, specifically Gen Z, are having less sex than ever. And they feel more uncomfortable watching sex scenes than previous generations. These trends don't obviously belong together. Or do they? Well, the decline of reading and the rise in pornography are not directly correlated phenomena. However, they are both symptoms of a cultural shift away from imagination within the structure of desire. I wish to submit to you today that the erotic and the pornographic are opposites, because the erotic effect is not about increasing explicitness. It is about the imagination and the exploration of the structure of desire. We have confused arousal with desire. Yes, pornography arouses us. That's its job. However, the way we understand love, intimacy, sexual connection is moving towards an increasingly explicit yet simultaneously erotically barren and sad landscape. Sex in its most basic form is a physical act that leads to reproduction. Animals procreate, humans are animals, therefore humans procreate. However, sex for humans has the ability to become something totally different. It can become a deeply erotic experience. It can be transformative. It can be transcendental. What does it mean for something to be erotic? Desire is one part of the erotic. It's one easy way that it gets translated. However, eroticism is something much broader that can encompass all aspects of life. Historically, eroticism was seen as a source of energy, vitality, and renewal. And Carson, in Eros the Bittersweet, tells of how Greek Eros denotes want, lack, desire for that which is missing. Creation occurs from a state of absence. We create because we feel that there is something missing, something that we need to address with our creation. Audre Lorde, in her essay Uses of the Erotic as Power, defines the erotic as a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. It is not only a question of what we do, it is a question of how acutely and fully we can feel in the doing. When we are fully present in what we do, when we are deeply engaged, Lorde claims that is an aspect of the erotic. We are engaging in an erotic act. It's kind of like the idea of a flow state. There's a Czech philosopher, Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote a book called Flow. And in the flow state, we are deeply compelled. We are deeply engaged. All of our attention is on the thing that we are interacting with, the thing that we are doing. And as a result, time gets distorted because we are so deeply present. And that feeling of utter fulfillment, of utter engagement, is erotic. Eroticism is an energetic aperture with many dimensions: playfulness, curiosity, imagination, fantasy. So the erotic exists beyond the dimensions of desire. However, desire is itself by nature erotic, and erotic desire transcends the physical machinations of sex. It's easy to see how the erotic components of flow enter into the sexual experience. However, this ends when pornography begins. Lorde defines pornography as the confused, the trivial, the psychotic, the plasticized sensation. Pornography generally is defined as any written, visual, or audio material such as photographs, videos, or books that depicts sexual behavior or nudity with the primary intention of causing sexual excitement. It's a transparent representation of sex that means to arouse and satisfy desire as quickly as possible, and it is formulaic, often unimaginative, and directed primarily towards the final goal, which is orgasm. The flattening of the erotic into the pornographic is partially a result of the capitalistic context in which it's created. Adult film platforms, like any other platform, makes the most money and profit when their users are consistently engaged and or deeply addicted. The addiction part we will get to later in the video. In The Pleasure of the Text, Roland Barthes perfectly describes the difference between the erotic desire and the pornographic desire. It is intermittence, which is erotic, the intermittence of the skin flashing between two articles of clothing, trousers and sweater. Between two edges, it is this flash itself which seduces, or rather, the staging of an appearance as disappearance. As the 13th century Persian poet and Sufi mystic, one of my favorite poets alongside Seamus Heaney and Rilke, writes or depicts it, "Last night I saw the realm of joy and pleasure. There I melted like salt. No religion, no blasphemy, no conviction or uncertainty remained. In the middle of my heart a star appeared, and the seven heavens were lost in its brilliance." While this poem is not at all explicit, it is deeply erotic. He depicts Eros as holy, claiming it is not blasphemous, it is as powerful as creation, and his experience outshines the seven heavens. It causes the disappearance of them in its appearance. You can see the connection there with Barthes. He loses his self. He describes it as melting like salt. That image of melting is actually deeply connected with the ancient Greek lyric poets like Sappho and Pindar. Melting entails that the sharp edges that define the boundaries of things begin to lose themselves. You, me. When it melts, it all becomes a confused puddle. In the union of self and lover or self and other, one loses the boundaries of one's own body, the integrity and control of oneself, which can be both joyful and terrifying. It's not a difficult claim to make that erotic desire and eroticism are delightful. Orgasm is probably one of the, if not the, most powerful and pleasurable experiences in adult life. Laughter probably is too. Actually, the erotic and the comedic have a lot of similarities in structure. They are both deeply playful in their structure. In Homo Ludens, Johann Huizinga discusses how play, which he believes is an activity fundamental to humanity and actually precedes culture, requires uncertainty, anticipation, reciprocity, symbolic action, voluntary participation, a number of aspects that both the erotic and the comedic share. All three, play, the erotic, and the comedic, are centered around experiencing joy and having fun. An experience of the erotic desire can include the chase or propositioning, the anticipation during and before, imagination through fantasy or bodily movements, and, of course, voluntary participation. The comedic, think of a stand-up show, has the same things. Of course, voluntary participation, usually people pay to go to these shows or they show up because they want to. But a good comedic atmosphere at a stand-up show is based on the exchange between the comic and the audience. The narratives intelligently and imaginatively woven that build up to the punchline, which comes as an exchange for laughter. Alan Watts, a Buddhist philosopher, employs play. In his framework, however, it's the Hindu concept of lila, to discuss the nature of the universe. He compares it to a song or a dance. Sometimes people compare it to a game. You don't dance or sing or listen to music to get to the end of the song. You do it for the experience in and of itself. The same could be said of erotic desire. Of course, both of these things have an end, orgasm and death. However, the most lively experience is the doing of the thing, not the end. Erotic desire, then, is fundamentally ludic or playful. The erotic and how we approach erotic experiences, not necessarily the experiences themselves, but our approach, can and should translate and encroach onto other aspects of our lives. The pornographic probably should not. Let's look at how some literature uses the structure of desire to demonstrate its playfulness. I'm thinking particularly of Ovid's Ars Amatoria, which is deeply playful. Let's just look at, we're not even going to do a deep, close reading here. We're just going to look at the titles of the book, of this series of erotic poems. They go, number 1, his task. Number 2, how to find her. Number 3, Search while you're walking, for, or at the theater, 5, or at the races, or at the circus. That repetition is clearly comedic. Don't forget her birthday. The rules of courtship start showing up. Look presentable. At dinner be bold. And more, and etc., etc. Of course, throughout the entire book of poems, Ovid is alluding to sexual acts, but his foci are everything that, hopefully for him, leads up to the sexual act. And the speaker positions himself as a guide, not just how to get the girl, but also how to interpret the signs and symbols of the erotic process, of the courtship process. We learn that love is filled with rules and norms. So while sex is part of our human nature, eroticism is created within culture. Notably, some practices that Ovid outlines, particularly around persistence and consent, do not resonate very well with modern readers. We should not take Ars Amatoria as a guide for modern sexuality and courtship. We should take it with us as an example of somebody exploring what is mediated through desire and in the aspect and process of desire. We should take it almost as a phenomenology of flirtation. Of course, desiring someone doesn't mean you'll get them. There are 1,000,001 songs and poems and stories written about the fact of unrequited love, written about that experience, written about a broken heart. And that reality brings us to the other side of the coin with desire, dejection. Carson talks about how human desire is poised on an axis of paradox, absence and presence as poles, love and hate its motive energies. Ovid demonstrates that in his poems. The experience of Eros, as we've talked about before, alerts a person to the boundaries of their body. We realize what it is we are missing. Quote, "It is the edge separating my tongue from the taste for which it longs that teaches me what an edge is." The identification of this edge can be painful, romantically and existentially. In Eroticism, Death and Sensuality, Georges Bataille discusses how we are discontinuous beings. That's his term. What he means by that is that we are born alone, live alone, and die alone. And that is extremely alienating. That alienation is part and parcel of our existence. It is something that cannot be avoided. However, as these discontinuous beings, what we do is we seek continuity. And the best way, or one of the strongest ways and most palpable ways that we can feel that continuity is through sexual union. A stark and unappealing truth remains, however. Even if we can get extremely close emotionally and physically with someone else, we can never become one. That paradox, simultaneous intimacy, and irreducible otherness is one of the reasons erotic desire has been an object of study in classic literature for centuries. The erotic is always examined in plurality, and Carson discusses how imagination is at the core of desire, of metaphor, and of reading and writing. These things are clearly then on an analogous playing field in her view and in my view. Modern media, in its sexual and non-sexual explicitness, is killing the need and the engagement of the imagination. Not only are we witnessing more explicit sexual scenes, but because of second screens, modern media is catering to audiences who are not fully present and aware. Recently, I watched 2001: A Space Odyssey for the first time, and I think that is the antithesis to modern media. It's not a particularly difficult movie to comprehend, but it's slow, it's reliant deeply on visuals and sounds, and you being fully present and attentive to it. Great movie, by the way. And I think it's erotic in its creative force. I think it is deeply powerful. Reading, too, is a deeply erotic act. We read black marks on white pages by someone else about other someone else's, and using someone else's words, in our minds we create images and stories. That is deeply powerful, deeply magical, deeply erotically magical. I actually discussed the philosophical significance of this in another video if you're interested in that. As Montaigne says, "My page makes love and understands it feelingly." The erotic structure of reading goes back to Homer, as many things in Western literature do. In Homeric Greek, please don't come for my pronunciation, The verb meneomai denotes both to give heed, to make mention, to give thought, and to court, to woo, and be a suitor. We as readers are wooed into this world that we are reading by the act of reading on top of what it is that we are reading. And when we read, we not only create images, but meaning. Huizinga doesn't just associate poetry with play. He actually says that poetry originates in play. He says poiesis, which is the Greek word for creation basically, is fundamentally a form of play. Art is fundamentally a form of play. Because poetry's main aim is not to communicate information into the world. It's about creating a secondary imaginative world, which is what play does as well. This imaginative space is the playground. Indeed, literature in general, and I would say particularly complex or challenging literature, gives our minds free rein to play. As Benjamin McAvoy talks about in his video about Gravity's Rainbow, the value of books like Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow is that these books relieve the burden of being a soul trapped in a body that will die. A body that craves pleasure, that eventually will be in a moment when pleasure can be no longer sought. These books relieve the burden of living. Huizinga writes that things have a different physiognomy than they do in ordinary life. As Lyle, the lycra-clad guru in Infinite Jest says, never underestimate objects. Objects become symbols. A rose is not a rose is not a rose. A rose is love. A rose is innocence. A rose is danger disguised as beauty. A rose is virginity. A rose is everything but a rose. In poetry, and by extension literary fiction, in my argument, objects and actions acquire a symbolic life. Erotic literature takes desire, the feeling of desire, the object of desire, the act of desire, as its object of exploration, and it never presents it unmediated. Oscar Wilde says it best. Everything in the world is about sex, except sex. Sex is about power. That counterintuitive assertion elucidates a fundamental aspect that differentiates the erotic and the pornographic. Pornography shows you bodies in order to arouse. Literary works employ eroticism to investigate broader aesthetic, psychological, and philosophical ends. In Ars Amatoria, Ovid is at formal play while discussing the playful elements of the erotic. Courtship is ludus, described in the ludic medium of poetry. He also creates knowledge about the erotic. While in those poems he highlights the playfulness and delayed nature of desire, in the Metamorphoses he shows different dimensions of the erotic desire and what they can do to people. In classical mythology, Eros is the mischievous, winged son of Aphrodite and Ares, with whom she has a lengthy affair where she betrays Hephaestus. One that really struck me when I first read it, and that still sticks with me today, is the one of Apollo and Daphne. Apollo is, of course, the god of music, divine order, the sun. He's the embodiment of divine order. But after he gets plucked with one of Eros's arrows, which now that I say those words, I realize they probably have some kind of etymological connection, he falls in love with the nymph Daphne, and he, needs her now. So he's running after her, and she's running, and it's pitiful, and it's deeply moving, the scene of them running, and it's tragic too, because you know that Apollo is a god and she is a mere nymph. He is going to get his conquest even though she doesn't want it. As she gets to her father Peneus' river, she pleads to him and to Gaia, the earth goddess, please help me, help me get out of this situation, and she's transformed into a laurel tree. This shows us that desire cannot be forced. Desire is an act of autonomy, of liberation. When someone else's autonomy is caged in by greater forces, including someone else's desire or lust or obsession, then desire and eroticism becomes impossible. This tale shows why the erotic is so feared, because it's so powerful. Exploring the erotic requires us to look deeply within ourselves and ask about what it is that we desire, what it is that brings us pleasure, what is it about our emotional aliveness, what is its content, what is its form. And this contemplation threatens systems of control, and it forces us to break rigid boundaries sometimes, and it explores deep and personal cultural values. An example of using desire to examine politics is John Milton's Paradise Lost. Although Milton wrote in the age of Puritanism, The way that he writes desire, the way that he depicts Adam and Eve and Satan, is deeply erotic, and it was highly iconoclastic. It would be a mischaracterization to say that Paradise Lost is attempting to arouse you. However, it would not be a mischaracterization to say that it is erotic. The portrayal of Adam and Eve, particularly prior to the fall, are unmistakably erotic. They are described as wearing their, quote, naked majesty without shame, as, quote, then was not guilty shame. The protagonists are described as being in constant states of Edenic bliss, in the land that they till, in the garden, the paradisical garden that they live in, and in the enjoyment of each other. This Eden that they live in is teeming with life, with the power of Eros. And the dynamic between Satan and the lovers explores the gap that creates desire. The fall of Adam and Eve occurs when they eat from the tree of knowledge. However, the knowledge that they gain is specifically moral knowledge. Prior to gaining this moral knowledge, their desire is innocent in accordance with Milton. When desire is governed by love and obedience, it is given freely and things are good. The deprivation from one another or their separation is what actually leads Eve to be persuaded to eat the fruit. Once they both eat the fruit, they obey God out of fear, and they both attempt to rule over each other. Power becomes coercive and based on fear. After the fall, Eros doesn't provide pleasure, it provides shame and guilt and negative emotions. The shift in the perception of sex in Paradise Lost asks a specifically and deeply political and ethical question. What is the proper relation between two free persons? What is the proper relation between humans and God? Desire functions as an inquiry into the hierarchy, into theology, into politics, into ethics. In Boccaccio's Decameron, an erotic work that came 3 centuries before Milton, erotic narratives reveal how people are dealing with social structures. And I believe that the text is a use case for how a narrative can be sexual but not explicit. The Decameron is a 14th century novel about a group of 10 young people, 6 women and 4 men, who are trying to escape the Black Plague in Florence, and so go to this beautiful country house out in the countryside of Florence. And it's told over 10 days, and over these 10 days, each of them tells a story that surrounds a theme. When I was reading it, I was not doing particular external research for it. I was just reading it. And the story that struck me was Day 3, Story 10, which I learned later is one of the most famous stories because of how deeply comedic and probably one of the more explicit ones without being pornographic it is. In this story, Alabek, a young woman, wants to become holy, and she meets this monk, mystic called Rustico, who sees that she's incredibly beautiful and gives into his temptation and wants to sleep with her. And in order to convince her to sleep with him, she tells him that they have to put the devil back into hell. And she sees it as a religious ritual, and of course he knows it's not. And then she basically exhausts him, goes back to town to find someone else who can help her put the devil back into hell, and the story spreads through the town. In addition to it being quite funny, it demonstrates the instability of language and how desire and eroticism can become almost hermeneutical. Putting the devil back into hell means nothing sexually, until it literally means everything sexually. Rustico is kind of the antithesis to Apollo. His power comes not from his physical power, but from his linguistic ability, his persuasive capability. The sexual act depends on the deceptive presentation and incorrect interpretation of social, religious, and sexual signs, which in turn elucidate how religion and eroticism actually function by way of similar structures, like rituals and symbols. And the joke works because we can adopt those rituals and symbols and manipulate them linguistically to mean something else. While pornography could provide actors dressed as Adam and Eve or as nuns, or even recreate the exact story of the Decameron, its narratives are stale. Boccaccio and Milton are creating playgrounds of the mind. Pornography is not. Unlike erotic literature, Smut uses the erotic as a rhetorical engine that drives the reader towards sexual gratification. There's a distinction to be made here because there's a rather disingenuous argument that authors of smut or readers of smut have made that if a book doesn't include sex, then it's not realistically depicting human experience because humans have sex, and so not depicting it would be unrealistic. There's a mean between no sex and sex, and if a poem or novel chooses to, it can depict sex and create erotic effects without it turning into pornography. In the consumption of pornographic materials, the viewer or reader becomes a passive observer. Erotic art mediates its aim of producing sexual feelings, thoughts, and emotions within the reader by bifurcating the reader's attention and asking them to pay particular attention not only to what they are feeling, but how it is that feeling is being created. The erotic feeling is always mediated by signs, symbols, composition, meter, something that is literarily relevant, something that is revealing something else about the erotic desire. This calls into action the reader's attention and their investigative skills, their critical thinking skills, and analytical skills, and that engenders liberation and agency, which is the opposite of what the pornographic is doing. While smut uses narrative to produce arousal, it, like its visual cousin pornography, relies on formulaic renderings that become an optimized delivery system for repeatable gratification. This repeatability is actually deeply nefarious for us as creatures who are easily habituated to specific input. A 2014 study in the incredibly well-respected JAMA Psychiatry Journal and a 2016 study in the Journal of Psychiatric Research provide evidence that humans can get habituated quickly and easily to repeated sexual images. Viewers whose mental reward systems are deeply dependent on pornography for sexual arousal become increasingly less aroused by the images that used to cause positive sexual responses. As a result, they seek more intense or new means of finding arousal. Contemporary publishing has learned to commercialize narrative forms that many female readers find erotically compelling. Sarah J. Maas's style of book content is not an empowering focus on the erotic because publishing industries are merely capitalizing on the oppression that led women's deferral of pornographic content consumption to written media. And these readers, like their male counterparts, are finding that they are increasingly desensitized to vanilla sexual content, which in turn induces an increasing amount of younger and younger women to seek out more intense content in order to achieve the emotional or physiological responses, which is very worrisome. Of course, this is because both visual and written pornography are profit-driven industries. Neither are ultimately for the benefit of the viewer or reader. Reading erotic literature, not smut, engaging with the interstices, the said and the unsaid, the seen and the unseen, the inner and the outer, are how we explore the structure of desire, the structure of the erotic. While the erotic can be arousing, it is both sexual and non-sexual. It is the life-giving force that imagination brings to literature. This is what we talked about earlier of imagination being at the core of desire, of metaphor, of reading, and of writing. These things are all connected by the power of the erotic. A former adult film star said that there's nothing sexual about porn. I take that to mean that we know that pornography is fake. It's theater. It's actors getting paid to do things consensually, ideally. There are an incredible amount of problems with the ethics of the maneuvering of actors within the industry. But it's naive or disingenuous to overlook the content of what is being produced and how it affects people's sexual desires. In Aristotle's Poetics, he discusses how mimesis, the imitation and representation of our world in art, is a natural human instinct and vital for learning. Aristotle presents mimetic art as a way in which we understand, order, and bring meaning to the world. The way we understand the world comes from the things we consume about it. The consumption of pornography doesn't end in pornography. It translates into our relationships with other people, the way we understand intimacy and desire and how the sexual act functions, the way we view other people. It has a lasting effect on the person who watches it. In modern language acquisition theories, input is much more important for linguistic competency than output. How much and what you consume of a language is a lot more important for you learning its structures and its ways of making meaning than it is outputting it. Because if you don't have input, you don't have the structures built into your mind, how can you output anything? If we can accept that analogy of learning a language as a way from gaining insight from the world and consuming erotic or pornographic images as a way of learning about human desire, we can see that our relationship with the erotic is being eroded. The greatest erotic literature uses sex as a means of philosophizing, of investigating, of knowing the world. Desire forms a channel by which phenomenology, hermeneutics, epistemology, and ethics are investigated. Curiosity is desire. The purpose of pornography is to end desire by stimulating it. By only feeding the fire of arousal, it burns the curious landscape about it, and it is up to us to tap into that life-giving force again. Let's go back to Lorde. She claims that the erotic connection is the open and fearless underlining of our capacity for joy. Once we begin to feel it in all of the aspects of our lives, we're going to begin to demand much more of ourselves and our experiences because our capacity for joy is so great. And we, now more than ever, need that revitalization. We need a renaissance. So, read on. If you want a way more in-depth explanation and investigation of this topic, on Substack there's a companion essay that's like 10,000 words. Read on.